Charlotte, an officer is facing charges for using flock inappropriately. Court documents reveal an alleged drug dealer was suspicious of a buyer and reached out to Officer Seth Elliott. Elliott then ran the plates through Flock and the state's centralized database of criminal offenders. Came back as an undercover officer, and he provided that information to the alleged dealer. Elliott is now facing a misdemeanor and is on unpaid administrative leave.
Hello. Welcome to the Chicago Justice Podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Siska. I'm also Executive Director of the Chicago Justice Project and an adjunct professor in the Department of Justice, Law, Criminology, and Security at American University. Today is episode 2 of our series on flock safety, which are known most commonly for their automated license plate readers, ALPRs. Today's episode will introduce some science to the discussion around ALPRs. Our guest, Professor Stephen Keener from Christopher Newport University. He and his colleagues authored a paper titled Surveillance, Inequality, Race, Poverty, and the Geography of Automated License Plate Reader Deployment. It is currently published on the Social Science Research Network website in a working paper status. Link will be below in the show notes. 100,000 of these ALPRs have been deployed throughout the U.S. with little to any oversight. Rampant misuse at the hands of law enforcement throughout the country. Sadly, the misuse always seems to focus on men using the technology to stalk current, former, or prospective love interests. Nothing creepy about that. Let's get to the conversation with Professor Keener and learn about what the science says about the deployment of 614 ALPRs in Southeast Virginia. Professor Keener, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, I'm glad to be here.
So, explain to my audience, what is network surveillance infrastructure and what role do ALPRs play in it?
Yeah, so ALPRs, automated license plate reader cameras, have come to dominate my life over the past year. And this wasn't necessarily intended, but just a quick background, because I think this will help inform our discussion going forward. In addition to my academic work, I am also a board member of Justice Forward Virginia. We're a criminal justice reform advocacy organization, and we primarily advocate for reform at the state level through the Virginia General Assembly. And as we do, one of the primary things we've been working on the past couple of years is fighting the expansion of ALPR cameras in Virginia. At one point, there was an attempt, and it's still kind of ongoing, to expand these cameras to all of the interstate highways in the states. And so we were the primary organization fighting that. We also have been trying to advocate for stronger guardrails on this technology. The reason I say that is I've been doing this as not part of my academic day job, but as just a side advocacy effort with Justice Forward. But I've been keeping my academic colleagues kind of abreast of what was going on in that space. And then in November of 2025, this past year, there was an ongoing court case in Norfolk questioning whether these cameras constitute a Fourth Amendment violation. And we can get into why that may be the case throughout the interview. But as part of that case, a federal judge forced the release of all the locations of ALPR cameras in the Hampton Roads region of Virginia. That sounds like a small thing in terms of just where these cameras are at, but it was a major thing because when it comes to the transparency regarding where these cameras are deployed, there is little to no transparency across the country. Most departments are not willingly giving up where they're putting the cameras, why they're putting them where they are. And so we're kind of relying on crowdsourced location data, people just seeing the cameras, uploading the coordinates onto an online site called DFlock, which is great, but there's quite a bit of margin of error that can come with that, right? So when this release happened, my colleague, who's a geographer, who I'd been kind of keeping up to date on the ALPR camera debate, texted me and he said, I've already started mapping this using GIS technology, and I think there's something here. We need to talk about this. So we met, we ended up working, and so that colleague's name is Dr. Johnny Finn. He's an incredible geographer. And as we can talk about in depth, it was obvious when you start to map these cameras in the Hampton Roads and you overlay that with sociodemographic variables, it was very clear if you want to know where these cameras are at, look for neighborhoods that have higher percentage of African-American residents and higher rates of poverty. And that's where there was more of these cameras. But it was obvious to the eye, and we're like, we want to make sure that there's not something else going on. There's not some other variable that's driving this, or that has that's more of a predictor. So we brought on Dr. Andrew Baird, who's also a colleague of ours, and he's a social science statistician. And we basically asked him, run as many models as you can and tell us, like, is there something we're missing? And come to find out, there's not. He found the same thing that was obvious to the eye. If you want to know where these cameras are at, it's about race and class. And so with that, we wrote an article. That article's under review now, but we consider this article, one, we're confident in our analysis, and we consider this important for the ongoing policy debate around these cameras and mass surveillance in general, that we released the preprint to the public. And that is publicly accessible now. And we're working up on our follow-up articles now. So ever since that, now this has come to dominate my life, because we are hearing from localities all across Virginia, especially, that are concerned about these cameras, that are concerned about the invasion of privacy that they pose, that are concerned about where they're being deployed, that are concerned about where the data being collected by these cameras is stored, who has access to them. And so we've been going around the state and doing education work, trying to educate the public on this, trying to expand our geospatial analysis beyond just the Hampton Roads. Because to go back to your original question, at the end of the day, these cameras are tracking people's everyday movements in their vehicles. And this is an expansive network of cameras. And as a result, the database in which so every time you drive by one of these cameras, there's a picture taken of your vehicle. That picture has your license plate. It can include your bumper stickers. You can see the make and model of the car, the color of the car, even additions like roof racks and things of that nature all get picked up. Those images then get sent to a shared database that is maintained primarily. The big player in this is Flock Safety, is the private company administering this. So this gets sent to a shared database that all Flock users can have access to, but also the local departments that are collecting this data, they can opt to share that data with other departments around their region, around the state, or across state lines. And so because of all the sharing that's going on, this database is massive now in terms of, just the images it's collecting, but also they're time stamped, and there's enough of these cameras around where if you're driving a vehicle in a city that has Flock cameras, your daily movement patterns are being tracked and can be recreated pretty easily using this expansive network of cameras.
Okay, so I want to get to the Fourth Amendment.
Yeah.
So the software can basically, especially if you're in underserved minority communities, it can pretty much track your comings and goings around the clock.
Yes. These cameras operate 24/7. So every time you drive by one, your license plate initiates the camera, the picture being taken. And so then we say this a lot, and I'll keep saying this over and over again. The vast majority of pictures that are taken by these cameras are taken of people just living their everyday law-abiding lives. Like if you drive to the grocery store and you drive by a Flock camera, a picture is taken of your vehicle. That image then is sent to this Flock database. That picture is accessible to your local police department and any other police departments that your local department shares their data with. Also, we know in states like Virginia that departments are actively sharing this data with the federal government. And so because of that, the federal agencies have access to this as well. In fact, we've had issues, for example, in Richmond, where ICE had access to the Flock data. So because of this, if you were a law enforcement body and you wanted to find somebody and say, okay, I want to know in general where this person goes on a daily basis, this network is your dream, because there are enough cameras, enough sharing going on, and the fact that it takes a picture every time you drive by, no matter what you're doing. That is what's made this database so expansive and then invasive, to the point that brings up the Fourth Amendment question. Are you essentially being searched every time you go by? Because not only are these images being shared into the Flock database, a lot of cities like Richmond, like Newport News, and other major cities around the country, they have these real-time crime centers now. And these real-time crime centers are integrating all this different surveillance imagery and videos. And so these images being taken by the license plate reader cameras are feeding into all the other surveillance, both images and footage being captured. And so at that point, then you have a pretty, I would argue, invasive look into people's everyday lives and movements.
Yeah, you point out in your paper, and I want people to think about this, the vast majority of people driving is within 10 miles, if not 5 miles of their house.
Exactly.
So if there's if there's cameras in your neighborhood, you're going to trip them every time you leave your house.
Exactly. Yeah. So like a good example, the neighborhood in which I live in. So there's actually, if you were to leave my house, if you take a left within 2 blocks, you hit a flock camera down the street that runs in front of my house. If you were to take a right, you hit one within 1.5 blocks. If you were to go north, you hit one within 2 blocks. If you go south, you hit one within a block. It is nearly impossible to leave my house without being clocked by these flock cameras. Whether I'm going to the grocery store, whether I'm going to work, whether I'm going to a brewery, like doesn't matter, right? Like those images are being taken. And like you said, most people, when they hop in the car and they drive in the US, you're not driving a far distance, right? You're driving a pretty small radius. And that's something we really wanted to talk about in our paper, because on one hand, you can make the argument, well, if we put a bunch of cameras in the neighborhood, it's not just the people that live in that neighborhood who are being captured in terms of their driving being captured. It's anybody that drives on that road, whether you live in the neighborhood or not, which is true. However, the people who are going to get their images captured the most are those that live in the neighborhood, because you're most likely going to stay within a small radius. And that is what our paper really gets into, is this, we talk a lot about surveillance inequality and the fact that, I think everybody should be concerned about this kind of dragnet surveillance, this expansion of mass surveillance that's happening with these cameras. But in reality, what we found in our analysis, and where the patterns look pretty similar other places, we're trying to replicate this analysis, that if you live in predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods, if you live in neighborhoods with high poverty rates, there are more cameras and more surveillance. And it's not just more cameras. We write in our paper also about the intensity of that surveillance in terms of the population share that the burden of which the surveillance is being felt on. And because of that, if you live in one of these highly surveilled neighborhoods, you're having more images captured of you. It is nearly impossible to move without being surveilled. But also, when this data is misused, when this data is abused, those misuses, those abuses are predominantly going to be felt by the communities that are most surveilled.
So you brought up a concept in the paper that I know about, but I teach adjunct at American University, and they had never heard of the students. Redlining.
Yes.
So can you explain for our audience what that is and how that affects the racial makeup of Southeast Virginia?
Yeah, and so we have a specific section in our paper which we talk about the city of Norfolk. And the reason we talk about Norfolk is a highly surveilled city, not just in terms of number of cameras, but cameras per capita in terms of their population. We also see that Norfolk is probably where in our analysis, the surveillance is most racialized. So for example, the census tract that has the most cameras actually surrounds Norfolk State University, which Norfolk State University is the only public HBCU in the region. And it's actually impossible to enter or exit the Norfolk State campus without crossing a flock camera. They completely encircle the campus. So those students cannot enter or exit. Whereas down the road, Christopher Newport University, where I'm at, that's a PWI, we do have a flock camera on Warwick, which is kind of a main thoroughfare in Newport News, but you can come and go on most parts of this campus without having images taken of you by the flock cameras. That's not the case for students and faculty and staff at Norfolk State, the public HBCU. So because of this and other factors, we actually decided that we wanted to have a separate section on Norfolk. And so Dr. Johnny Finn, my colleague, that's the geographer, he works a lot on the history of racial redlining and the impact it has today. And so racially redlining tells us about a time in history in which neighbors were graded by the federal government in terms of their quality, right? And historically, what we found, and not just in Norfolk, but across the country, the neighborhoods that were redlined, the neighborhoods that were graded, these kind of low level neighborhoods were predominantly Black neighborhoods. And they were neighborhoods that were the least invested in. They were the neighborhoods that were most exposed to environmental toxins. They were the neighborhoods that were most exposed to things like lead paint, right? Kind of like, and they're the ones that were most harmed by mass incarceration and the criminal justice system. And so racially redlining piece doesn't tell us a lot about today, but it tells us about the history of disinvestment in communities. And the communities that were racially redlined decades ago are the communities that have historically been underinvested in. They've been over-policed, over-criminalized. They've been most exposed to environmental toxins, right? They have felt the brunt of social ills for decades. And so we thought it was important to overlay the racial redline maps to see, okay, if we were to look at where these cameras are at today, are they largely in formerly racially redlined neighborhoods? And they are. In fact, in Norfolk, it's almost not perfect, but almost perfect that when you overlay the racially redlined neighborhoods, you see the vast majority of cameras are in those. And so what that tells us is these neighborhoods that have been historically underinvested in, over-policed, over-criminalized are now being over-surveilled. I want to add one caveat, and I won't say who it was, but a police leader in Virginia that we've had conversations with about these cameras, pretty intense conversations with. This police leader made the argument that by putting these cameras into these neighborhoods, that actually shows that they're investing in these neighborhoods. I cannot emphasize enough how much I disagree with that. And like, to me, it's been shocking. I've been sharing with people to say, like, am I missing something, right? Like, is there something on this? Like, does this argument make sense? Because to me, it makes no sense. Because the way I see it is, so these neighborhoods that we've historically underinvested in and over-criminalized, our investment now is to surveil them more, which more surveillance is going to lead to more police activity. And I'm concerned about the continued over-criminalization that's going to happen in these neighborhoods. And I'm also concerned, we write in our paper about this, that when it takes this form, this modern surveillance form, it gets tech washed, because the assumption is, if we have these predictive policing algorithms, if things are data driven, it has to be objective, right? They can't be racially biased. However, the outputs are only as good as the inputs, right? And so if you're selectively collecting data from predominantly Black neighborhoods, you're going to inevitably get racialized outcomes. And so I think that's another thing that really undermines that police leader's argument that this quote unquote investment you claim to be making in these neighborhoods is actually going to harm them more than it's going to help them.
Right. And it's a mixture. I agree. And it's a mixture of the fact that these neighborhoods are both under policed and over policed.
100%.
Under policed, which means they're not putting the resources in to solve the crimes that are happening and actually target offenders that are hurting those neighborhoods. At the same time, they're over policed because the police have played a role in destroying the communities.
Yep.
And over policing, arresting people for miscellaneous stuff that they don't get arrested for in white communities or don't end up with prison sentences. So, I mean, it just sounds like another version of, like, you go from slavery to Jim Crow to parchment farms to the fight against civil rights, mass incarceration, and now add another layer of just like massive surveillance that's on 24 hours a day.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying there is really important, right? And this idea that, like, we're hearing a lot on this, and I think we really have to rebut it, is there's an argument being made by supporters of this technology that this is helping prevent crime. This is going to help reduce crime. These cameras are fully reactive, right? There is nothing preventive about them. And what's frustrating is we've got a long history of research on, like, what works in terms of prevention. Things, youth intervention, violence interrupters, reducing inequality, reducing poverty, like those kinds of things, working on the social safety net, like those are like long-term preventive things when it comes to reducing crime, reducing violence. The idea that these cameras the idea that an argument is being made that these cameras help prevent crime is just, criminologically it's groundless, right? There's no empirical research that's going to support that. But also, I wonder this a lot. I've brought this up in meetings before. Well, if, for example, right now, like, crime has been going down, across the country, right? Not universally, but most places have been reductions in crime rates. And so places that I think it's because they feel on the defensive regarding these cameras. They feel like there's a lot of local opposition to them. So they want to prove that these cameras work because they want to keep the contracts going. They're intentionally putting in the media and making arguments around, well, these cameras are one of the reasons why crime is down. But in reality, crime is down in localities that have these cameras. Crime is down in localities that don't have them. I also wonder long term if we saw an uptick for a couple of years, all of a sudden, are all these arguments we just made around these cameras, is that mute now? Like, do they no longer work? Like, because in reality, like, they're not actually reducing crime, right? They are fully reactive technology.
Right, and they will switch.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And like, it's happened in Richmond, and I'm sure it's happened in other places, but Richmond media just picked up on it. Richmond media actually it was text messages between police chief, the mayor, and other leaders, because there was there's been a pretty vocal local opposition to extending the contract with Flock in Richmond. When all was going on, these text messages that are now public, they have been released publicly to media. There was text messages between the police chief and the mayor and other city leaders around like trying to saturate the narrative in the media around Flock cameras, like basically looking for ways to put Flock into stories to try to say, hey, look how great this technology is. And I mean, we're talking about real tragedies happening across the city, hit and runs, people being killed. But all of a sudden you start to see Flock showing up in headlines and Flock showing up all the time. And it was clearly a concerted effort to try to change the narrative around Flock as being this kind of miracle crime-solving technology. And I think the reason they did it is because they felt they were on the defensive, because they felt the pushback against city funding, the city continuing to fund these cameras to the tunes of millions of dollars.
Right, and this is the same argument with ShotSpotter.
Yep.
Right. Professor Eric Pisa at Northeastern did an evaluation of ShotSpotter. First one, independent that I know of. Kansas City, Chicago. What did ShotSpotter say they did? Prevented gun violence, increased arrests for gun violence, increased convictions.
Yep.
Great. Evaluation. You do none of that.
Yep, exactly.
But what it does do is it leads cops to more ballistic evidence and leads cops to the victims quicker, supposedly. Okay? Well, now Chicago, that got rid of ShotSpotter, everyone's pushing for them to get it back because it helps them find victims quicker. Wait a minute. The company promised all these things. We spent $11 million for God knows how many years, and it didn't work.
Yep.
Crime went up and down during that time, from 22 to 25 to 26, right? Well, yeah, beginning of 26. Crime plummeted.
Yep.
Pretty much all over the place, within reasonably close all over. How can it be the policies of 19,000 different police agents that at crime drops around the country, socioeconomic differences taken into account, they're pretty close to each other? Could it be the policies of 19,000 police agencies or something in our society that changed during that period of time? Every technology, every politician, every police chief is like, we're the reasons that happened. Don't look at all the other jurisdictions around the country. You know, and I saw Flock online. They have some papers on their website about all their miraculous achievements and more arrests and all of this. They're like reductions in crime. And it's like, we know deterrence doesn't work for a lot of people. The idea that this license plate thing is going to be the big deterrent that we were waiting for 200 years is kind of ridiculous.
I brought this up to, like, it was just to a non-criminology colleague to be like, all right, I'm going to walk through this. And because to me, this sounds far-fetched, but I want to keep checking myself. Right. And I asked the colleague, I was like, all right, so, we know a lot of gun violence is committed by young people who have access to firearms. It's typically unplanned, right? Something escalates. There's a fight, things escalate, right? And so I was like, the argument then being made that this can reduce this kind of violence is that teenager with the gun who's impulsive, who's angry, and is in an argument isn't going to use the gun because they know that a Flock camera is 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden their chances of being caught are increased 15%. Like, no, of course not, right? Like it's just illogical to think that, but that's the argument that they're making, and it's very frustrating.
It's rational choice theory.
100%.
Right.
100%,
And no, people are not making rational choices most of the time about going to kill people.
Exactly.
And the less material things that you have, the more in poverty you are, the more unattached to society and the economy, the less you're able to worry about making bad decisions and giving stuff up. Mm-hmm. That's just the reality. But here we are, it's 2026, and we're still arguing the same things. It's mind-boggling. Oh, I got two quick questions.
Yeah.
What did you mean? I like this phrase, historical echo.
So to me, the way I think this ties into a larger theme of our paper in terms of the implications, and kind of when we got to our results, like we got through our results and we're like, to us, there felt like so many implications, but we really need to boil it down to the big ones. What are the big takeaways? Why does this matter? And something that we talk about in the paper and continue to talk about publicly is this feels like we're doing the same thing we're doing again. We're just doing it in this tech washed manner. And that, when it came to broken windows policing, when it came to mass incarceration, the predominantly Black communities, high poverty communities were targeted, and it was intentional, right? Like this wasn't by accident. This was intentional through colorblind policies and things of that nature. Like this to me feels like the next step in this isn't new. This idea that the neighborhoods who are being overtly surveilled now are the neighborhoods who historically were over policed and broken windows. They were over incarcerated during mass incarceration, historically disinvested in. And so this is just repeating the cycle again. What I'm particularly concerned about, and I think my colleagues are and others are in the space is, and I mentioned this earlier, I am always concerned that when this becomes quote unquote data driven, when it becomes behind the veil of tech, I have a concern of this stuff being tech washed, that while it's the same thing we've been doing again, because it's data driven, the argument's going to be, well, this is just what the data says, right? How can you argue with the data? And something that we have been intentional throughout the research, we are intentional in the paper, we're going to continue to be intentional about is our research says nothing about the intention of why these cameras were put where they were. We don't know. Like, we do not know why Norfolk police decided to deploy the cameras in the manner they did. We don't know why Newport News did. We don't know why Richmond did. We don't know that. But our research isn't about intent, it's about impact. Because no matter your intent, even if your intent truly is, maybe the intent had nothing to do with race and class. Maybe that never crossed their minds. And to give them that benefit of the doubt, maybe that's the case. But even if that was not the intent, the impact's the same. If you over surveil communities of color, especially with a technology like this, that brings with it so many risks of misuse and abuse that we've already seen. Like, this is not hypothetical. Like, we see this technology and the data collects being abused and misused quite frequently. The communities that are going to be most impacted by those misuses, those abuses, are those that are most surveilled, right? Like, and that's the reality. That's the impact of it, no matter the intent. And so I do have concerns that as we continue to move in this kind of more surveillance tech world, that those racial biases are now going to be built into the algorithms. They're built into the surveillance tech. They're built into the decision. They're built into the data that then creates the decisions about where to deploy these cameras. But in reality, we're doing the same thing we've always done when it comes to over policing, over incarcerating, and harming and not helping marginalized communities.
We just to close, now it's about 3 or 4 years ago, we won a lawsuit accessing the basically DC's gang database.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And before, my dog, thank God it's being recorded. Okay, I'll start over. So about 3 or 4 years ago, we had won a lawsuit against the Metropolitan Police Department area in DC. Mm-hmm. And we accessed their gang database. Mm-hmm. And before giving it the data they ordered to give us the data, they had around 3,600, a little over 3,600 people in the database. Confirmed gang members, validated gang members, and gang associates. Mm. They gave us around 1,900. The chief went in front of the city council before they gave us the data, sworn and said, we just decided to erase the gang affiliates.
Interesting.
So like 47% of the database got erased
Before you all had access to it.
before they would give it to us.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's like, wow, your data collection practices were so corrupt that you would rather delete that data than share it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you should definitely be trusted with flock system cameras and ShotSpotter and gang databases. I'm sure you're doing everything perfectly morally and legally.
And something so this is, I think, a really important add-on when it comes to this project or this study and kind of its reverberations. Virginia passed a bill last year that was supposed to put guardrails around this tech, and other states have passed bills on like data retention, who the data can be shared with, right? Like Virginia did this. From the get-go, Justice Ford, Virginia, and others argued it wasn't strong enough, but it was passed. So that went into effect July 1 of 2025. Report comes out in February 2026 from the Virginia Crime Commission around, okay, they did a survey of police departments to see, are they complying with this new law? What they found right away is departments were not complying with the new law. And so some of the things they weren't complying with, the data retention. So the data in the flock database in Virginia now is only supposed to be stored for 21 days. And if it's not being used in an investigation, then it's supposed to be deleted. Well, there was departments that admitted they were storing the data longer than 21 days and were not deleting it. There also was caveats that said that you can no longer share that data with the federal government or with agencies out of state, especially with the concerns of groups like ICE accessing this data, right? Come to find out, departments are continuing to share that data actively with the federal government and with departments out of state. Also, there was like a public awareness measures they had to do. A bunch of departments admitted they weren't doing that. And so right away, there was a couple and there's all of these results, but also 110 departments didn't even bother to complete the survey. And so these are just of the departments that completed the survey. So we have 110 departments that didn't even do it. Right away, the question was, well, what's going to happen to these departments? They're breaking the state law. They are actively sharing this data with the federal government, with other states. They're retaining it longer. And their response was, well, they're going to get a strongly worded letter that's going to encourage them to follow the law. Something else we asked is, well, let's say, for example, you are a local police department that really wants to protect this data and follow the guardrails, right? In theory, you can toggle on and off the departments you share your data with. So, for example, let's say you were Newport News and you found out that, hypothetically, I don't know, Chesterfield was one of these departments that was breaking the state law. You could toggle them off and no longer share your data with them. However, departments were not made aware of which departments are not following the law. So they don't actually know the departments that are not. So and this is really important. So you could be a department, like, let's say you're Newport News and you're saying, hey, we are not sharing our data with the federal government. We're not sharing the data out of state. However, if you're sharing with a department that the federal government, through the access of that other department, now has access to your data. So they do have access to your data every day, even though you're not sharing it with them, right? And the reason I say that is, like, we create the guardrails are not strong enough to actually prevent this data from being misused and this data from being abused. And so in reality, as long as this data exists, it's going to continue to be shared with others. And also, like what you're alluding to, in terms of the data has to be used for criminal investigation, but kind of like you're saying, like, that's so broad in terms of it could be everything from a homicide to jaywalking, right? Like, and the things that can put you on hot lists, which then if you're on a hot list, when you drive by those cameras, it's going to ding and alert law enforcement. The things that can put you on these hot lists, like the gang databases, is pretty expansive, and we don't actually know what's all going into putting people on these hot lists. And so I think for me, the big takeaway is, even with this new state law, there's still such expansive ways that this data can be used and shared, and they still aren't following the law, right? It wasn't even that strict of guardrails, and it's still being violated.
Yeah, I have found that legislators and actually a lot of reformers don't have any real appetite to hold police departments accountable for anything. I tried to get in Chicago ordinance passed where the chief of police had to certify that they looked at the details of every settlement and judgment against the police department for like any kind of misconduct. And that they had to attend a city council meeting once a month. And I had reformers tell me they're too busy to attend a meeting once a month. They're too busy to look at the details of all these cases. So in your example of Virginia, well, make the chiefs of police superintendents certify that they've checked that that data has been erased. And failure to abide by it is whatever the strongest felony is by the police chief and whoever's certified in charge of the flock data in that department. Right?
Because in reality, the punishment right now is a class 1 misdemeanor.
Oh, yeah, they're never.
Yeah.
No, they know the prosecutors won't prosecute, right? That's such a small level. It's so ridiculous. Well, that's very frustrating.
Yeah.
Professor Steve Keener, thank you so much for jumping on with us. We really appreciate it.
Of course, anytime.
That was Professor Stephen Keener from Christopher Newport University. Nobody listening to this podcast or watching it on YouTube is shocked that there are race and class disparities in where the ALPRs are deployed. It's just another injustice in a long line of injustices and disparities in the American justice system. This is why every new technology needs to have massive oversight that includes annual audits by inspector generals about how these technologies are used and where they are deployed and who they're deployed on. If we know anything about new technology provided to police in this country, it will always be misused against communities of color, the poor, and women. It will always be used for the benefit of men in power, mostly white men. It is a very sad consistency in the American justice system. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next week. Thanks for staying with us to the end. If you believe in this work, like this video and subscribe to help us amplify our message. And if you want to be part of the change, check out the links below to support or get involved.